So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid we can't start because this is supposed to be webcast and the cameraman who I was speaking to 5 minutes ago has disappeared. And he wanted me particularly to welcome the people looking at the webcast. So that was his instructions to me. So I'll just give him a minute, and if he doesn't come, we'll have to start without him. Because the organizers, first of all, said, although we're very late, we could have an hour, but they've just told me we must finish at 3:45, so we've only got 45 minutes. So I am going to have to start, ask the, here he is, fine. So welcome, are we live now? Yes? So welcome to those who are watching this on the webcast. So I want to introduce the people who have not been introduced so far. So Fatih Birol from the IEA was introduced this morning. I think Shuli, who you have not met before, who's the editor-in-chief of the Caixin Media, dean of the School of Design at Sun Yat-sen University. She and her team follow Chinese energy sector very closely, and they're recognized, or she is recognized around the world as a leading commentator on the situation in China. Mario Molina spoke this morning, but I don't think you were introduced. So he's a Nobel Laureate in chemistry, a professor at the University of California in San Diego, a key contributor to understanding the stratosphere, in particular, the issue of the ozone layer. And right now, he serves on President Obama's PCAS, the President's Committee of Advisors on Science and Technology. Nakicenovic, I introduced this morning. Christof, Rühl, I introduced this morning. And one more person I've not introduced is Lennart Bengtsson, who's had a distinguished career in meteorology and climate change. He's a professor at the University of Reading in the UK at the moment, I believe. He's participated in the development of the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasting, where he was head of research and then director. He's held many other important posts, had many awards. He's currently co-chair of the European Academy's Science Advisory Committee studies on sustainable energy supply and consumption. So time's quite limited, so I'll ask the speakers to be quite brief. We're here to look at the changing landscape of fossil fuel dependence. Where are we going? And I'm going to ask, to begin with, Lennart Bengtsson, who's going to remind us that we have actually had some benefits from fossil fuels, because we hear the negative side. Please.
Thank you very much. I have been working quite a lot on complex nonlinear systems with different complex solutions. And I was always very intrigued by this, which is very popular in the United States, which is called a sort of history what if. How would it happen in history if there would be something that had happened? And of course, the course of history would have taken a completely different development. I will not go into any details, but so I asked myself, assuming, for example, that after the instead of using carbon and later oil and gas at the Industrial Revolution, assuming that we have never been able to find out how to use it, what would then have happened? Well, I think that you don't need very much imagination that without fossil energy, our world would have looked completely different, because we probably wouldn't have been able to find any such a useful source of energy, which fossil energy is, because it exists in large amount. It's very compact. You can store something like 12 kilowatt hours in a kilo of oil or coal. And of course, that has been extremely beneficial. The fact that our societies have developed as they have, that we have these sophisticated cultures that we have a high population, etc., probably wouldn't have been possible at all without fossil. Now, having said that, it's not here to prize fossil energy. I think we should just recognize that it has been quite useful. But now we are entering a situation where we don't know exactly how much fossil energy is left, and furthermore, in over quite some time, we have been aware of the negative effect of it. through the carbon dioxide and the carbon dioxide effect on the radiative balance of the atmosphere and the effect on the climate. So I think that, having said that, I think we should be aware of that we shouldn't really take a negative attitude. And in the previous discussion we had just before I came here, we brought up the question of sequestration. And if we can find an efficient and economical and I would say, reliable way of storing carbon dioxide in the ground, that would, of course, give us a possibility to use carbon dioxide or fossil energy even for the future, because we need to have something like that. Without fossil energy and nuclear energy, I cannot see how we can get, unless we work on it for a very long time, robust system to provide the world with suitable amount of energy.
Thank you very much. Christof, you spoke this morning about the future of fossil fuels. You wish to add something now? I think, was everybody in the morning session? I hope so. It seems yes. But what do you want to add now on the changing pattern of fossil fuels?
Lots to add. I'll be very brief this time. 2 points I think are worth it, because people, they think about alternatives to fossil fuels, and they start to realize that fossil fuels are going to be around for a long time in the future. And so that raises 2 questions. Number one is, everybody asks, what can be done in terms of innovation? And we need innovation. And some people say, we have it, we will get it. Others, maybe it's coming too slow. To foster non-fossil fuels, to support them. And that's the first point. I think there's a big page we can take out of the book of experience of fossil fuels, which has been unfolding most recently in the US with the so-called shale revolution, shale gas and now tight oil, to look at the conditions under which big innovations actually happen. And it turns out it's no different in energy from anywhere else. The prime condition seems to be a competitive environment. And that's what happened in the US. Look at the gas revolution, so-called. Very high prices, a lot of known resources. Shale gas as a resource was not an unknown. And then a lot of small and medium-sized companies moving into that space, trying to connect the two. And we shouldn't forget, lots of them lost their shirt in the process. Few of them succeeded and developed these technologies. And the big guys, the BPs and Essos and Shells and Exxons and you name them, came in only later to buy that technology and transfer it somewhere else. For an economist, it's Economics 101 on innovation. Competitive pressures are breeding these kind of responses. That's the first problem, and the point here is that this points to a need to put renewables a bit out of the shelter of regulation and as much as can be done into a competitive environment. And the second point, I think, is not very hot in the debate currently over the last 2-3 years, but at the bottom of it, I think we all agree that one needs a price for carbon in order to facilitate that innovation. So the question I want to raise at the beginning is what kind of price for carbon? Because there has been not only a shift towards no longer discussing climate issues and prices, but also when it's discussed at all, increasingly a shift towards advocating carbon taxes rather than cap and trade.
Absolutely.
And I think that would be a mistake. I think it is very important to realize the globalization, again, take a book from the experience of fossil fuels, the enormous globalization in trade which occurs. A tax system would work to the same effect only if you had a multinational tax agency unifying it. That hasn't even happened in the worst of economic crises, much less likely for things like climate change. And so with taxes individually different, you would see tax competition, dig holes for carbon sequestering being dug in the wrong places and all the rest of it. I think it is important to recognize the system as it is and to keep arguing, even if it's hard, for a cap and trade system. Without the flaws we have seen in Europe, take that as a starting point, develop it. But don't fall into the trap of thinking a tax imposition and then the money be used for whatever finance ministers need it for would be as effective as a tax system, because individual tax systems are extremely hard to connect. Individual trading systems, we know it from financial markets, if anything, are even too good in connecting to each other. And that's what we need here. Those were the 2 discussion points.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to ask Shuli, because China is the biggest coal user in the world, and in fact 25% of the world's coal is used in generating electricity in China.
Okay, I'm very humbled to join the panel with so many top experts and share with you a journalist's perspective. I'm sure you've read about heavy smoke in Chinese cities. And many of you know that the Chinese government determines to significantly change its energy mix, which will affect fuel supply around the whole world. How fast will it grow and on which type of energy? The answer will depend on how well it tackles some inherent problems. Now here I share with you 3 issues I found most important. First is China's economic structure needs a change from the focus on resource-intensive industries to an innovative-based service economy. The government needs to scale back its power and let market play its magic. Great promises have been made during the recently closed 3rd plenum. We look forward to see the real action. Second, the mispriced energy cost needs to be corrected. It has been artificially low during the past several decades, encouraging high energy consuming industries. After a decade of painful reform, oil and coal price within China is finally linked to the market now. However, we need to make the price of gas and electricity reflecting the real cost. On top of that, environmental cost needs to be computed in. Indeed, a reasonable price will hurt the industry sector and some residents, but it will entice more players into the field, boost the supply, increasing efficiency, and change consumption habits. Third, break the monopoly of state-owned companies. China needs advanced technologies to export its new resources, to increase efficiency, and to reduce emissions. But the big oil SOEs stand in the way. Innovation not just on technology, but on institution. Because the largest enemy of innovation is monopoly. Some market liberalization policies should be formulated and paced carefully in certain areas. However, we need to be very clear about the direction and speed up. Many Chinese are inspired by the US story and want China to move along the road of energy self-dependence. The world is watching changes in Chinese energy appetite. The 3 issues I mentioned hold the key to these questions. Among them, SOE is the hardest one. Only with real substantial reform SOEs, along with continuous progress of the other 2, can we see light at the end of the tunnel?
Thank you very much. Mario, would you wish to, I'm sure you do wish to contribute to this discussion of the changing landscape of fossil fuels.
Sure. I don't have prepared statements. Let me react to some of the things I've heard. And first of all, I certainly agree historically they have been very important, but like many other activities of human society, we have limited resources in the planet, and one of those resources is the capacity of the atmosphere to just function as a wastebasket. And so the problem is that we're getting there, but there's no doubt they have been terribly important. But again, I want perhaps to summarize or to emphasize what I understand the perspective is from the both science and economics point of view. And that is that fossil fuels will certainly continue to be useful, will continue to be there, but given their importance, it's very important for society not to postpone much more what's already very clear, that some limitation needs to be there that is not there already. Call it a price on carbon. The details, whether it's a cap and trade or a tax and so on, I agree, that's something it's another issue that could be optimized. And for example, in the US, there's talk about what would be politically more acceptable is some sort of price on emissions, but the resources being returned to the public rather than incorporated into the government. And so, but these are more political issues. But from the science perspective, it coupled again to the economy, it seems to me quite clear that we have to begin to push much harder for non-fossil fuels alternatives. It looks like carbon capture and sequestration, which looked very promising not too long ago. It's a bit too expensive now. So that's not in the near future. Perhaps technologies will improve. So what are the options? The options are certainly efficiency is a big one. Talked about that morning, just to decrease the use. But the other one is certainly you have to reach something sensible. That's why the 2-degree temperature limit is sort of artificial. It's not what science tells us. It was a compromise between science and cost. Okay, it's something reasonable, because you want to stop at 1.5 degrees. That would be extremely costly. But the problem with using fossil fuels much longer is that CO2, part of it has a very long lifetime in the environment, more than a millennium. Okay. Some of it, okay, so half of it is immediately taken up. That's why it's urgent to begin to do something about it. And we can sort of subsidize some of the alternative energies. But I agree with many of the statements. At the moment, the percentage is relatively small, so it's not sort of likely that they will suddenly begin to contribute a large fraction. So from that perspective, one puzzle that I have is nuclear energy. I know there's another session on that, but here again, it's perhaps a matter of misinformation. The public is perhaps not sufficiently well informed of what are the relative advantages and disadvantages, because all fossil fuels have some dangers. Also, coal mining is quite dangerous and so on. So I'm just relying, for example, on an article in Public Affairs by Ernie Moniz, who is a very good friend of mine, was also in PICAS and now the Secretary of Energy in the US. And he tries to analyze, like the MIT group, which I was so many years at MIT, I based many of my conclusions on them. It's just an analysis of the pros and cons. And like many activities of society, you just have to be very careful. You have to do it properly. But if you do it, then, for example, nuclear energy should be a possibility. And even the price is something that is questionable, depends on what interest rates you use. But take shale gas, nothing else than shale gas. The one worry is that it would take too long, but it should be considered just as a transition fuel. But even there are some very careful analysis that if you do it properly, it's quite reasonable. If not, you have leaks, and methane is, of course, more active than CO2 as a greenhouse gas, but it's relatively cheap, maybe 15%, 20% at most of the costs for proper control, and then it works well. Same thing with nuclear. If perhaps society is just not has not done it very well so far, but in principle it can be controlled, it can be done very safely compared to other energies, but people are very worried about that. That's why nuclear magnetic resonance, which is something very important in chemistry, there's a Nobel Prize in that. When you apply it to society, you have to drop the word nuclear, and it just becomes magnetic resonance if you use it for health purposes. That's the same syndrome we're worried about with nuclear energy, but it could be very, very safe. So to me, that should be part of the solution, together with energy efficiency, together with very wise economic analysis, where it's, again, you put a big price on the risk of having major catastrophes as something really to be avoided.
Thank you very much. It's exactly the same thing with fusion. No one talks about nuclear fusion, least of all about thermonuclear fusion. They just talk about fusion. Vocabulary matters. Fatih.
Thank you. Since the subject is fossil fuels, I wanted to make 2 points. One, not every fossil fuel is similar to each other. Gas can bring, if replaces coal, major reduction in CO2 emissions. However, the prices are very important. When you look at the United States today, as a result of the shale gas revolution, US emissions are now back to 1990s, and a major revolution for me happened in the US electricity generation. Share of coal in the US electricity generation was about 50% 5 years ago, and today it is 35%. Why? Because gas penetrated the market. Now here, and therefore the CO2 emissions went down. Why did it happen? because Americans are much more environmentally conscious than the Europeans? I don't think so. I'm sorry to tell you. Because Americans lack the more innovation, shale gas is new? No. There is only one reason. Because gas was cheaper than coal. That's it. But now, after that, the gas prices went down to $2.5, and now it is creeping up. Today it is $4. According to our analysis, if it comes to around $5 gas prices, then coal may come back. Unless there is a regulation to ban coal to use in the new power plants or existing power plants, as the current administration is trying to do now. The same story in Asia. Look at Asia. We shouldn't be dreaming that the gas has a very bright future. It all depends on prices. When you look at the East Asia, about 70% of the power plants which are already ordered, it's not a forecast, they have ordered, companies pay the money, utilities, are coal-fired power plants. 30% is gas plus oil, renewables, and everything put together. Why? Because to produce 1 kilowatt hour of electricity in East Asia from gas is 2.2 times more expensive than from coal, and people would go for coal. We cannot blame them because it is cheaper. Therefore, the pricing is a very important issue. To sell gas or trying to sell gas because it is cleaner without backed up with regulation or anything or a carbon price, it will be impossible. So this is the difference between those two, and I believe there will be continuing competition between coal and gas when it comes to the power plants and everywhere in the world. Therefore, the carbon pricing or regulation is a must if we want to see gas to see the light of the day, as it is more expensive in most parts of the world. And even in the United States, we may see creeping up. This is one. Second, about oil. A few years ago, we were discussing in the oil circles, are we running out of oil? Now, this discussion turned to be that there is a big abundance of oil, so we don't need to worry about the oil at all. I didn't agree with the first one, and I don't agree with the second one. Why I don't think that despite the shale oil revolution, or the surge, better, there is still, we will see high prices and there is a need for production growth and investment is the following. In addition to demand growth, there is one issue that many of us don't unfortunately see, or sometimes we forget it. Namely, oil fields are like human beings. When they are young and strong, they produce a lot of oil. They come to a certain level of maturation, peak, and afterwards they start to produce less and less oil. So therefore, when we look at the fields, conventional oil fields worldwide, what we see today is that many of them are in a decline, and just, this is important, just in order to produce oil as much as we produce today from the existing fields, we have to find 40 million barrels per day of new oil production, which means 4 new Saudi Arabias, just to compensate the fields which are declining. This is important. And we have 2 tasks. One, to meet the growth in oil demand. Second, to compensate the fields which are declining. Therefore, we cannot forget the issue of declining oil fields. As a result of these 2 things, I don't think that we are in an abundance of oil. Definitely, these new shale oil, unconventional oil resources are important, but the issue of decline in the oil fields is something we need to take into consideration, and we shouldn't forget this aspect as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatih. Then Naki, the last word before we go to questions.
Okay, thank you. I would also like to follow up the thread of the discussion and start with Lennart's point about the benefits of the fossils. I mean, we shouldn't forget we depend 80% on the fossil energy today. And at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it was the other way around.
fossils brought incredible benefits to the human society. The current economic output is on the order of $10,000 or almost 10,000 euros or almost $13,000 per capita. That has to do with the energy, that we had abandoned energy during the fossil era. Now, the real challenge is that close to 3 billion people do not have that benefit. I think it's the asymmetry. And for that, we will need the energy. So and in particular, energy services, in my view, the issue is then more how we'll be sustainably supplying future energy needs, rather than the question how much of that will be fossils, how much will be renewables, how much nuclear. We need a portfolio. And I would like to make that point a little bit more explicit. The current, no matter what one thinks about the availability of fossils, clearly in principle they're limited, even if they are huge, and some portions are really huge. But they're limited in the ultimate sense. I think they're kind of an endowment of the humanity because of the carbon that they contain if you oxidize the carbon. So just to give you a comparison, the atmosphere right now has about 800 billion tons of carbon, and that's already causing climate change. Conventional oil and gas reserves, which we know with relatively high degree of accuracy, despite all of the ambiguities, they're on the order of 500 billion tons of carbon. So that indicates that we cannot simply burn all of that without CCS, without carbon capture and storage. And then if you add coal, that might be on the order of 15 times as much carbon as in the atmosphere. Shale gas is also a few times that, according to many of the estimates. So the endowment is really what our society is willing, what we can afford and we want to tolerate in the future. And so the second, I think that will determine us leaving the fossil age. The second point I would like to make is that we have to think in terms of systems. For example, I mean, Fatih and others have amplified the good properties of gas. I cannot but agree more. Gas is an important bridge to the future. On the other hand, gas and wind combined really well. We have to think about the systems, not just gas on one side, renewable on the other, because gas can provide storage, virtual storage for wind. When there is no wind, you can put gas power plants on. That reduces the emissions even without CCS. Then, if one agrees with the assumption or the proposition that we will need a large portfolio of options, including fossils, including renewables that are sustainable and clean, then I think we cannot afford not to develop carbon capture and storage as part of that portfolio. And I think this is where I see a real problem. Going from 80% fossils down to 20% fossils, for example, will not happen overnight. That will take many decades. We don't have that much time to waste because of the climate change. And carbon capture and storage might be an opportunity. We don't know whether it is because we have not deployed it commercially. We only have power plants, and in technology, unfortunately, problems only emerge when you really upscale it, large scale. So that was my second point. But let me also make the third point. That I think it's important since we talked about China a bit. We shouldn't forget, I'll finish in a second. We shouldn't forget that China is producing many commodities with coal that we are consuming. So we are responsible also for some of the Chinese coal use and emissions. And I think it is nice to see in many OECD countries energy going down, emissions going down, but we are causing gray emissions and gray energy elsewhere. Again, there we need a systems view.
Thank you very much, Naki. So I'm going to open the discussion floor now. 2 points first. The speakers, many of them mentioned renewables, efficiency, nuclear, but I'd like the questions to be on fossil fuels. There's been other sessions on those. Fair enough that you mentioned them. For the questions, let's try to stick to fossil fuels. We're also taking questions by Twitter, so when they come in, there's somebody going to wave to me. It's very hard for me to see the audience, but I see we have a question here. Can we have a microphone down here? And it'd be helpful if you say who your question is to, if it is to a specific person.
My name is Kjell Areklet from Uppsala University, but also now from University of Texas in Austin, as I'm a guest professor there. And I have questions to you all, but I start with Fatih Birol. And we have heard about the Shell revolution, yes, also from Shell there. My name is Shell, yes. just 2 weeks ago, there was a scientific report released at the University of Houston, a very detailed analysis of 8,000 wells in Barnett Shale, and it's now a formula that you can accelerate, calculate what is the possible future production probability. And we have the fact that there is 5 places where they produce shale gas in US. 4 of those has already peaked in the production, and it will not come back again. The only one that has not peaked is the Marcel, and it will be still true. But the Barnett has peaked, Haynesville has peaked, and all the other. So the numbers, the revolution for the future is not there any longer, if you look into the scientific, what we are doing. So it has to, the flow rate is something that has to be discussed much, much more than you do. You discussed reserves and resources, but reserves and resources must be turned into flow rate. And I must also say that the International Energy Agency has changed very dramatically to the good side during the last year, and I appreciate very much what you are doing in that and the decline in existing fields and all this. But again, the flow rate must be considered much more decent. So what you say about the fact that probably shale gas and shale oil will peak in 2016 according to the latest analysis. So how will that change your picture when you have got that numbers?
You want to respond?
To me or to Mr. Shuli?
I think the question was that shale gas is going to, the flow rate's going down, and the idea there's a revolution becoming self-sufficient and things you said in your first talk may not be correct.
Yeah.
That's my
I think
summary.
the shale gas and shale oil, they're a bit different, so therefore 1 minute each. For shale gas, yes, there are very steep decline rates, and if you do not inject money in the shale gas deposits, you may well see this decline rates continue. But this is something like a bicycle. You have to turn the pedal all the time. And what is happening is that the pedal is turned in the United States, and the shale gas production in the United States is increasing since 5 years in a continuous way. But what will not happen is that to keep the produced at shale gas $2.5 will not happen. According to our analysis, we need to see prices around $5, and this may well mean that unless in the United States there is a regulation to stop coal, we may see coal to come back with the increasing gas price context. This is one. Second, for the shale oil is a bit different. You need, according to our analysis, about $80 oil price to make the shale oil profitable, those incentives, those investments. $80, for us $80. And if that $80 is not there, we may not see this production to grow. And even in that case, the resource base is very limited. Shale oil resources are about 6 times smaller than the shale gas resources, and we expect around 2020s this will come to a plateau and then decline. Unlike the shale gas, we don't see a continuous increase in the shale oil prospects within the United States.
Very quickly, and can you get the microphone back? You've had a long time already.
The fact is that they need to drill thousands and thousands and thousands of wells, and each well takes a certain amount of area to use. There is not enough area to have all these wells drilled, and that's the fact.
I think that's a factor where I come from in the UK. The US pretty big, though. But I don't know if, Christof, you want to add to this? And as for the question of the price at which shale gas is viable, it very much depends if it's got light liquids in it or not. That's a bit technical.
Just a few points. Number one, there's a fundamental difference between these shale resources and conventional oil in the sense that they're so much more widespread. Conventional oil is sort of highly concentrated. Everything is about who controls that area or country. Shale is much more a matter for policy discussions, and you can see that in the US, where production is still concentrated in the continent, where there are huge known resources on both coasts, which haven't even approached yet because of environmental concerns. Number two, so far, these developments have constantly surprised everyone on the upside. Nobody was expecting that a few years ago, how high they really grew, and there's no signs of this abating right now. It's true that prices will adjust, of course they will, because right now a lot of gas is only produced as a byproduct of going for shale oil because of this huge price differential between oil and gas. Soon the US will become a natural gas exporter. That will bring up gas prices up, and the natural way things will fall into place is that will balance with oil. But thirdly, the US is now also reaping the benefits of the first mover. What we have seen is these new innovations taking place. And last year in North Dakota, a state which lives from tight oil, we have seen a 38% higher increase in output than in the rig count, meaning that more and more, less and less rigs are necessary to produce a given amount of oil as technology improves. They're reaping the efficiency gains which you always get as a new technology becomes applied and is refined. So I wouldn't be quite as pessimistic. And lastly, running out of space I don't think is an issue. One of the things few people are aware of is it is in the US a matter of state legislation how far apart these wells are supposed to be. Mostly take place horizontally, and by just shifting it closer, you can continue that process for years. So we all have this discussion, and I would be skeptical. I would not claim that this is going to disappear the next few years, just the opposite.
Okay, so another question. We have one that was over here. We have anything on Twitter? No? Our Twitterati is silent. Okay, so please say who it's for, if it is for a specific person.
No, I'm just asking in general. I'm Tejveer and I'm a student at KTH in Stockholm. I want to ask a question about abiogenic petroleum resources, because the research is going on, and it's in near future it might be posed as a possible fossil fuel. So what kind of impact it is going to make on environment if we discover abiogenic petroleum resources? Second.
Sorry, I didn't understand. I don't think the panel did. Your first, what you said at the beginning, you said the impact of?
Abiogenic petroleum resources.
Oh, abiogenic.
Okay.
Abiogenic.
Naki's going to answer this. He understood.
To the scientist.
To be honest, I can't answer that. This is a very controversial topic, how much of the hydrocarbons are biogenic in origin, how much they are abiogenic. I mean, I think at the end of the day, my view is probably both in different proportions, in different reservoirs, if I assume correctly that was your question.
Yeah, I mean, because we had a class on this, and the professor was giving lecture on abiogenic petroleum resources, and I was just wondering, like, if fortunately or unfortunately, if we have those resources available, then what kind of impact it is going to make on climate change, and in absence of CCS technologies at the commercial scale.
Let me try to deal with that. So the question is if there are sources of oil that don't come from organic material in the past, basically. And there are people who've claimed that all oil is like that, but it's discredited. And if that's true, there could be vast reserves in areas people haven't looked for oil. But in fact, there's lots of vast reserves of fossil fuels and methane hydrates. Okay. I mean, the world's awash with fossil fuels of different kinds. There's plenty to burn the planet if we want to do it.
Yeah. This was a Russian theory which claimed...
Other questions? There was somebody here.
Yeah, we have a question.
We have a question. Chris.
Sorry. Shuli, please, would you?
Yeah, I have a question to the experts here.
Okay, let's ask Shuli first.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, because right now, we all know that the coal is the backbone of Chinese energy use. But now, because this year there is pollution among big cities, so there are a lot of concerns about the coal-fired power plant in China, and the coal industry is declining. I mean, in terms of revenue and profits this year, declining around 10% in the first 3 quarters. But now this year my question is that how do you comment about the coal to gas? Because now coal to gas became a very hottest industry in China. About 15 very big projects approved, and there's estimation that probably there will be $100 billion investment by 2020 on coal to gas. And I want to hear the experts, what do you comment on that?
Who wishes to go? Fatih.
I think is an idea. It's a very interesting idea, but there are two challenges. One, the price differential between coal and gas need to be substantial enough first, and investors should believe that it will be like that for many years to come. This is one. Second, especially in the context of China, this technology requires a lot of water. And water in China, to have available water for these projects, may be a substantial barrier, which in turn may increase the cost. So therefore, in that context, a major growth from coal to gas is not something that I would expect from China and elsewhere.
Christof?
Let me just add very quickly, there's also the fact that one of the reasons China is so much coal-based is that gas accounts only for about 4.5% in the Chinese energy mix, which explains why there are huge efforts on all fronts to generate gas, or including coal from liquids. There's the price issue and there's the competition issue. We have seen that China also has huge shale resources and has targeted its 5-year plan for shale generation and is falling behind. And one of the reasons relates directly to what you mentioned in your talk, the monopolists for state oil companies. What they did basically was parceling out the most prospective regions, giving them to these 3 major oil and gas monopolists, and giving them targets, and then not much more happened. Some cases because of bad geology, no infrastructure. Some cases because of no technology, no cooperation with foreigners who would be more risk-averse, risk-liking. And in some cases because that happened to be in coal-producing provinces where the regional government didn't see the point of having these federal oil monopolists coming in and taking away from their rent. At the same time, it's interesting, around the fringes, we see a lot of attempts from utilities, coal companies, sometimes even tobacco companies, and others trying to apply these technologies and get somehow to gas, but it's too small at scale. So it's your very own point, as long as the competitive environment doesn't really change, this, as Fatih said, will take a long time.
But however, you think shale gas is more hopeful than coal to gas?
Because it is cheaper in the end.
So, if you'll excuse me, I've got to ask a question myself. Christof, you said a lot of shale in China, but my understanding, a lot of it is in Lanzhou and places where there's rather little water. Although I think it's a myth that you need a lot of water for shale, you've got to have some.
Yes, absolutely. There's 3 reasons in 3 different circumstances why it did not happen according to plan. Other than this funny situation that you have a plan, but no longer the whip to execute it, really. One is that geography and infrastructure, no water in some places, no pipelines, no infrastructure. The other is failed attempts to cooperate with foreign majors, not making participatory offers. And also, this is not the kind of stuff where you go to the US and you look at the technology and you have a key which opens the door in China. You need to do substantial adjustments because the geology is very different. That requires this competitive environment. And thirdly, that an oil company is given the task to produce this somewhere. There's a keen regional government sitting on a mountain of coal and really is not very supportive. And so in all 3 circumstances, simply not much happened.
Okay.
So the major challenge is from the restricted market access. Major challenge,
Restricted market access and giving something which has to do with innovation to our state-owned monopolists never really works very well.
I've got a question on hold. Is it a quick one?
Yeah, a very quick one. I mean, I think there is recently some interest and some progress in using methane hydrate.
Yes.
This is, of course, an enormous amount of energy, and apparently in Japan they have had some modest success. Yes. So I wonder if, I would like to hear from you who are dealing with these sort of things.
I pass it on to the scientist. I'm just an economist, and we've heard about the difference. But from an economic commercial perspective, it is very far away indeed still because of the big problem of how to channel it and get it out and suck it.
Nevertheless,
so this may be something for the future.
It has been done off Japan. I was in Japan and heard what they're doing.
It has been done recently in Japan, but long time ago it has been done in Soviet Union.
And by the way, let me
technically it's doable.
Let me advertise something which is the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics has an energy group of which I'm a member, and we're just about to produce a report on, not just about, we are beginning to work on a report on methane hydrates.
Before we go into more of these areas, I think it's very important just to keep in mind what you have said. It's much more likely that the limiting amount on the limit on what we can produce in fossil fuels is the thinness of the atmosphere, not our ability to find new ones and burn them.
Absolutely agree.
Especially if you think about hydrates.
Okay. I'm sorry I interrupted your question. Someone here, I can't see. You got the microphone, please.
Right now we are dependent on byproducts of fossil fuels, like certain types of plastics which are used in industry. Once we run out of fossil fuels, how we are going to manage, or where we are going to get these materials from? Do we need to think about these problems which are going to occur in the future right now? Is there a need?
Well, let me give an answer. I shouldn't. I'm supposed to be the chairman. But, I mean, if we're serious about the climate, we're going to stop using fossil fuels. Will there still be plenty of oil around to make plastics? But maybe that's the wrong answer. Anybody have another answer?
No, I think that's exactly the case. Again, the fundamentals to keep in mind is peak oil, peak coal has all been around forever. It's never been true. We never run out of a fossil fuel anywhere. The thing to keep in mind is what he has said. The limiting factor on that system, and it is a system, is more likely to be the inability of the atmosphere to absorb the carbon than our ability to dig it out and burn it.
Can I just add very quickly, carbon is an important material. We shouldn't forget that. As long as it doesn't end up in the atmosphere, that's not an issue. I mean, we are building already cars out of the carbon, bridges, maybe one day we'll be aeroplanes, maybe one day we'll be building even roads from carbon. So carbon is a good material.
So we're over time, but I think let's just take one more question. This lady here. I'm afraid it's going to have to be the last. Oh, we have a Twitter question. We'd better take a Twitter question and then you, last one from the floor. Can you read it out? I don't want to disappoint our remote viewers.
We have a question from a person in the crowd called Marlene. And the question is, what impact do you see fossil fuel dependence have on energy security and national security today or in the future?
Who wants to take that?
I take a first very short step. I think it's often equated, less fossil fuels means more energy security. That's wrong. You should not, security lies in diversity. You've seen this in Japan. If they wouldn't have had the fossil fuel infrastructure to import coal, oil, and gas to back up power generation after Fukushima, if they only had the clean nuclear energy we were talking about, there would have been no fossil fuel energy. That sounds very harsh, but I wouldn't want to live in a country which only lives on wind energy, because that is not very safe state of affairs. So it's the diversity which matters.
Let me give my answer to that, which I think may be the same. The fact is, right now, there are plenty of willing sellers out there and sources of supply. So in some sense, it doesn't look at this issue. But if you're in Japan or India, by God, it looks like an issue.
Just a quick point. Infrastructures are required for energy import and export. And infrastructures can be also often seen as dividends for peace, because they also build confidence, they build good relationships. I mean, Soviet Union is a good example. I mean, you had lots of problems, but in energy somehow worked. So one should not underestimate that the fact of building infrastructures can increase security as well.
And I think fossil fuels, I don't agree to put all the fossil fuels in one basket. They are different. Coal, oil, and gas. Coal resources are widely distributed throughout the world. Gas with the shale gas, it is even more distributed now compared to a few years ago. In terms of oil, the situation is a bit different. And therefore, when we look at the future, I think oil and geopolitics will be more and more interwoven compared to other fossil fuels.
Okay, so we take the last question here. Can you...
I would like to ask about the perspective of shale gas development in Europe, because we discuss it many times as for the United States, also the perspective for China. But what do you think about shale gas as an option for Europe? Thank you.
Okay, Fatih.
So in Europe, we have shale gas deposits in Poland, some in France, Germany, and Ukraine. But in none of them, I would expect before 2020 significant growth of production. There are a couple of barriers in terms of geology, in terms of the data, geological data, and in some countries, public resistance. And even in the UK, I wouldn't expect before 2020 any significant growth in shale gas production. But of course, if the public acceptance problem is solved, especially in Central Europe, the countries I mentioned to you, we may see after 2020 some contribution from shale gas, but given all these parameters, I wouldn't expect it to be at the scale as the United States.
I think I can speak for the UK. The geology is totally unlike the US, much more complicated. And the other problem is the population density, because there is a problem on the surface impact. And the last problem is the difference of mineral rights. You own the gas under your land in the US, so you don't care if your farm's mucked up. If you're given $15 million and you move to California, that's not the same in Europe. It makes a difference. Christof, the last word on this, and then we close.
It's a big example for this new role of policy, of local policy rather than geopolitics in faraway places, Europe. You look at it, you have Poland and the Ukraine literally begging for very aggressively for more investment in that for obvious reasons. You have France and Bulgaria outlawing, putting moratoria on fracking, make it impossible. You have big debates in the UK and in Germany. All of this is what our industry likes to call above ground considerations. And below ground, you have much less prospects than in the US. That's true too.
So in terms of geology, it's more difficult than China?
In terms of geology is, yes, except probably in the Ukraine and this bent Romania.
In the UK, it's much more fragmented. There are many more faults, so it's a little bit more risky, etc. I think we have to end there. So I'd like to thank the panel and all the audience for their participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.